Lawmakers in New York are trying to ban ghost guns after the UnitedHealthcare CEO murder. Democratic lawmakers in New York have called for Governor Kathy Hochul to ban so-called ghost guns, like the one allegedly used by Luigi Mangione, the man charged in the murder of United States healthcare CEO Brian Thompson. In an open letter to the governor, Rep. Ritchie Torres wrote, "The probable use of a 3D printed ghost gun by Luigi Mangione to assassinate Brian Thompson, the CEO of UnitedHealthcare, underscores the need for a complete and comprehensive prohibition of ghost guns in New York. The explosion of ghost guns onto the streets of New York and into the hands of dangerous people has led to an unprecedented crisis in public safety." The letter called for legislation that closes the manufacturing loophole in ghost gun laws and closes the ghost gun loophole in gun manufacturing laws, and called for a ban of privately made firearms. A criminal complaint in Pennsylvania says the weapon in the shooter's possession was a 3D printed pistol loaded with 9mm rounds in a Glock magazine with a handle made of plastic and a slide and threaded barrel made of metal. He was also carrying a 3D printed silencer as well. What are your thoughts just in general? And if you want to break down even the category ghost guns, this is where I'm curious as to what, is this just a gun that has the serial number shaved off of this? It's something that's untraceable. Is this purely something that is manufactured by an individual? So what are your thoughts on ghost guns, and what are your thoughts on legislation that would seek to ban them?
Yeah, so ghost guns is a weird one because they call it ghost gun, right? They call it a ghost gun because that's the best way to demonize an actual pistol that's manufactured by somebody. And that's what this is. That's what a ghost gun is. So obviously there are some firearms, including Glock, that are made of plastics, polymers. That
Portions
plastic,
of it are. We should be
portions of it are. Exactly.
The portions containing the explosion of the round actually going off are almost always going to be metal components, so they can withstand the pressure.
Yeah, correct. And so 3D printing technology has rapidly evolved. I mean, it's amazing. The things that you can make in your house off a 3D printed machine with the better materials, better ways of manufacturing and cutting the plastic is awesome. The problem I have, transitioning into my thoughts on the manufacturing loophole, the lower that was used in this was manufactured by this guy, Luigi, right? He manufactured the lower, which is an 80% lower. And there's a finalization of that. You got an 80% lower because you can get it 80% of the way, not including the inserts. And what they really mean is the serial number, because they want to be able to track it.
I want to break this down for people too, just so they understand. So the lower meaning the actual portion that your hand grips around. And then there's the upper receiver. For rifles, it's a little bit easier to explain because they're bigger components, but the barrel sits in top on the rail or the upper receiver, which is attached to the lower. So what Mike is describing is literally the lower and upper portions of a pistol that come together to make it a functioning firearm.
Yeah, and that lower, or any part of a weapon system that's made of plastic that could be self-manufactured. The loophole is I have an FFL SOT, and in my company under my FFL, I have the ability to manufacture a firearm. And there's a process, right? You have to make it however you make it. It could be machined, it could be 3D prototyped, whatever. I have to be able to put a serial number on that and then register it with the ATF. So whenever I put it into the system, it can now be FFL tracked and transferred. So that's the loophole, because if you make a firearm, for example, the lower component, the place, like you said, that your hand goes on for a Glock is where the serial number is. The serial number can be on the upper, but it's generally on the lower because you could swap the slides. In fact, the slide that looks like a standard Glock slide was not manufactured. He likely purchased that. It's just considered a part. Mm-hmm. So the actual part of the weapon system that's tracked now is going to be that lower. Well, now the ATF can't track it. So here's my thoughts on it. One, this guy who did this, I've never in the history of my life seen such aggressive investigative work by law enforcement so quickly in anything in my life, right? How many people are killed everywhere across the country, one-on-one, and you have this situation where, I get it, UnitedHealthcare, a CEO of a healthcare company. But how much do we know about the Trump shooter, right? Nothing. We know the DNA, biometrics, conversations he had day of, surveillance video, all the tech, family history, genealogy, relationships, academic experience, everything. The affidavit, the manifesto, verbatim, every single thing. And yet we don't know anything about that particular person who nearly killed the 45th, now going to be 47th president of the United States.
Well, there's one main reason for that, I think, and that's because he has an additional hole in his head now.
True.
So
that could be one of the components.
So that case, as far as capturing the person, that didn't require Sherlock Holmes to get on the case, right? It was like, hey, here's a guy laying here with an additional vent in his head, which that's what happens when you bring a weapon to a political rally and you start firing. Also, he was younger, and I don't think he had the diversity in background and experience that this particular, I think this guy, what's his name? Jordan? What's his name? Luigi, yeah. I think he had, graduated college. I think that there was more to dig into. I think that the other person, and again, you know me, I'm not conspiratorial at all. And I've heard a lot of people saying this. We know so much about this one and the other. Well, one of them was on the run and the other one was never running again. You know what I mean? It's a slightly different investigation.
No, good point. Good point. I just mean like the investment by the national media to dig into it.
Yeah.
And then again, like many cases like this, it's like, how many normal people were killed with particular firearms that aren't ghost guns? Ghost guns are really rare in actual shootings, percentage-wise.
Does it just mean untraceable? So would a traditional Glock that somebody shaves off the serial number, would that then be considered a ghost gun because it's no longer trackable?
Yeah. I mean, it's not by the media definition, because this is a media definition for sure. It's an untraceable gun that's manufactured and homemade.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah. So this gun, he didn't have to go and get a transfer. There was no evidence of him purchasing a firearm. But does it really matter? The dude was a law-abiding citizen before he became a murderer, right? He could have went out and purchased a firearm. He was of age. He didn't have a criminal history, zero criminal history, and he could have just bought it. He actually likely wouldn't have had a malfunction if he would have just bought it. He had several malfunctions to the extent the gun community thought he was running a particular model of firearm that requires a bolt action override. So you would have to roll the bolt out to chamber and to actually extract the cartridge or round that's in it. So that none of that was happening. He just didn't maybe test fire it and was running different gas system or a different gas system with the suppressor he had on, which is inducing a malfunction. But it's like, why now focus on the ghost gun? Well, it's because it's just another tool to be able to go after people who are doing things like making guns in their basement. It's like, should that be allowed? I personally think it should be, because we're focused on the gun. What we should be focused on is the actual problems that arise from people, right? That it's a people problem, not a gun or tool problem. Again, he could have bought a gun from Bass Pro and used that gun, and then we'd be sitting here talking about that. By the way, pistols by a long shot are mostly used in murders than AR-15s, than rifles and shotguns.
Yeah, they're concealable
by a long shot.
Yeah, they're concealable.
It's just very rare to use ghost guns.
Yeah, I don't know where I land on the unfettered ability to produce a firearm. And so for people listening too that may not be familiar with firearms, I would say, in my personal opinion, the lower, which we've already described, is kind of where the magic happens in the firearm anyway. You know, the upper is where the barrel is going to be, and on a rifle, there'll be the gas system and all these things, and it could be direct impingement, it could be gas. The lower, though, specifically, you know, I'm thinking of the sear, which is a mechanical piece that people can go look at on the internet. But that particular piece is largely what allows a weapon to function in a fully automatic capacity as well. And so that lower, by playing around with those components that you could make, you could work your way around some of the legislation and regulations that are in place. Good morning, everybody. As you know, Change Agents is an Ironclad original, but what you may not know is that for over a decade, Ironclad has worked with brands and individuals to create world-class films, series, podcasts, and ad campaigns. In fact, I've been working with Ironclad for the past few years. I was introduced to them on a project through the Navy SEAL Foundation. I've worked with them on a variety of projects, even up here in Montana, long before they proposed the idea of change agents to me. They're the best in their field. And I say that because there are plenty of people out there looking for the best, looking for the cream of the crop, looking for the top of the triangle. And if you're looking for that, you need to look no further than Ironclad. If you ever need media by way of film, a series, podcasts, or ad campaigns, they have you covered. Do you think that is there a possible happy medium? Because, I mean, other than installing a camera in somebody's garage where they're making these, or basement, you know what I mean? It would allow people to really navigate in whatever direction that they want to go. And I don't know where I necessarily land on that. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think part of it is like the question is what constitutes a firearm, right? It's like, what's a gun? And is a gun the ability to shoot a projectile? Because if that's the case, I mean, it's real easy to convert a firearm, for example, that shoots a ball into an actual firearm, right? So it's like, what are we talking about? It's like if people are prototyping what they think is a firearm, it's likely a lower. And then when they put it together, because they made a polymer lower and then they put a upper on it, all of a sudden that's illegal. And then that's the felony. And that's the reason that we're going after people. And then how do you enforce that? Because like if you're a company and you're prototyping firearms and you haven't even got to the FFL process where you're putting serial numbers on the guns, is it legal in that interim? Do you have to have an FFL SOT and a manufacturing checking the block license to be able to do it in your basement? It's like, that's where it gets funky for me, because I think the government is too involved in our lives already. And then if you can't identify the specifics, then what are we really talking about? I mean, I have, for example, an OSS cane that came from the Office of Strategic Services that we think it is. And it's a cane firearm. Like you could actually trigger it and shoot a 22 round that depresses, comes out the end of it. Is that a firearm? Or is that a relic? Is that an antique? Is it something that is classified? I mean, it's inoperable, but I'm like,
it might be all those things.
It might be all those things, but it's like, how much is too much? Like, for example, if you make a lower for a carbine, and you actually, it's easy, for example, to get the specs for the CAD file to make a lower. Is that illegal to make as a piece of metal? I deal with this all the time, traveling with firearms and even FFL transfers. If you have a lower and you have an upper, and the upper is a 10.5 inch upper, which could be considered a short barreled rifle once attached to the rifle or the lower, that together is not illegal. When you put it together, when you actually assemble it.
You mean those separate? They can be in the same carrying case, but not connected.
Correct. I could ship that in the mail to most places in the country as an upper, but it's only illegal when you attach it. So I have many short barreled uppers, but they're not attached to lowers. So the regulation is, it's only illegal if it's attached. So it's like, well, then what's the point? Like, what are we trying to do here? Ultimately, we're trying to reduce crime, reduce murders, and that's a people problem. We're uberly focused on, like, what was it called? The butt stock thing, which is the dumbest thing on the planet.
Oh man, if you hadn't asked me, I would have been able to tell you. I know what you're talking about.
Bump stock.
Yeah,
I think it was a bump.
Yeah, BUM, Bravo uniform Mike, no pun intended, Papa.
That's right, bump stock. So it's like somebody in the Mandalay Bay, this psychopath, which I find it odd, we don't know anything about him, kills 50 plus people in Las Vegas, right below the Mandalay Bay at a Jason Aldean concert. That happens. And because of that crime and a couple other well-known crimes, we go after this stock. And it's like anybody who uses this stock knows it's a piece of crap and it's stupid, because you could run flat one-stage triggers that will actually run a reduced split or faster shot time than a stupid bump stock.
Yep.
So that was the one thing that under Trump, they handed over and said, we'll make this illegal. Again, I think all these frivolous things that they focus on are unconstitutional and we shouldn't be focusing on them. Do I think background searches are good? Some of that regulation and process of criminal investigative backgrounds is good. Yes. But to focus on the firearm and all these nuances, I think it's silly, especially the 80% ghost guns, because they make it seem like this is a systemic issue, which is why all these people are dying on the streets. That's not. It's poverty, it's mental health, lack of father in the home, and the black market of guns on the streets.
I was going to ask you about that. One of the things maybe to close on, the narrative is often there's this scourge of ghost guns invading fill in the blank. Do you think that that's actually the reality, or do you think that there are probably very few people that are actually playing around in the 3D printed homemade firearm space?
Well, like it's the average cost of a 3D printing machine that's worth a shit is tens of thousands of dollars. So you imagine, and I've gone down that road. I have a 3D printing machine. I've gone down that road. It takes aptitude, patience, and money in order to make things that are actually, people think it's like you set up a printer, you get it off from a pawn shop, you bring it into your mom's basement, plug it in, and you could start printing guns. That's not how it works. You have to go into forums, you have to CAD file, you have to get the technology. The CAD filing software is thousands of dollars just to get that plugged into the system. Again, to make a product that's worth a shit. So it's like, how many gangbangers do you know that are 3D printing guns in the inner city in poverty, but in between slinging drugs? It's just not happening. So it's like, it's not a thing. And I was going to pull up the statistic actually, because I just saw this recently. How many ghost guns used in crime? And crime is a better statistic because it's not just like murders. It's like how many times were guns actually confiscated in these circumstances. And police submitted requests to the ATF to trace ghost guns, and it jumped from 1,600 in 2017 to 19,000 in 2021. But that's their tracking of guns they confiscated on the streets, not guns used in murders. So
I would also want to know what they describe as a ghost gun. Is that just a weapon that is it produced by a third party, or is it just something that's had the identification removed?
So that's a good point, because it says here under new federal rules, ghost guns implemented in August are commercial manufacturers of ghost guns. Assembly kits are required to include serial numbers. So guns that don't have serial numbers can be considered a ghost gun.
So that
which is wild.
Yeah, right there off the bat. I mean, here where I live in Kalispell, weapons are currency. I mean, petty theft is a real thing, and they trade them upstream for drugs. If you have a grinder, you could take the serial number off of pretty much any weapon that you were to steal, and therefore it would fall into that category of a ghost gun.
Yes. Yes. I mean, that could be any gun on the streets. And for some reason, I mean, it's a thing, right? For some reason, people think, maybe because of the movies and CSI, that that's going to somehow allow you to commit crimes. You commit a crime with a gun and you're rolled up. It doesn't matter if you have the serial number or not, because the tracing of that gun doesn't matter. It's the crime that was committed with the gun. So you could have a gold AK pulled out of Saddam's house, but if it's committed with a crime, it's like, that's what matters. It doesn't matter the tracing. Oh, this was Saddam's gun. It really doesn't matter. So the getting rid of serial numbers really doesn't mean anything. And to be honest, I would have to look at the numbers, but I'm going to put it out there that likely a Glock lower is nearly as inexpensive buying it than it is to produce it from the polymer plastics that are worth the crap.
Oh,
and I've
cheaper.
done some yeah, it's like what is that worth? Well, I guess it's worth something if you don't want any trace to what you're doing, or you can't purchase the firearm. But again, the person who can't purchase the firearm, or the person who committed prior felonies and can't get a gun because of background check, is he the one who's 3D printing firearms in his basement with $10,000 worth of equipment? I just don't think it's as plausible. And I think the whole thing is silly as a focus, especially in legislation, because it's like there's so many other things that we could be focused on.